Darryl Morey hired by the Sixers. How impactful is this move? How did it all come about? What does it mean for this team moving forward? Michael Kaskey-Blomain covers the Sixers for CBS Sports, and he joins us now on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. MKB, what's up, man?
Mike, what's going on, man? Thanks for having me on.
All is well. All is well. Well, it's going to be official, it sounds like, this weekend. Darryl Morey will be the new president of basketball operations. Let's start with that. How impactful of a move is this? It kind of came out of right field, and all of a sudden the Sixers look like they have a guy they've been after for a while now.
Yeah, I don't think it's possible to overstate how big this move is, Mike. This is something that the Sixers have desperately needed for a while now in terms of just some stability and some direction in the front office. And, you know, it's a hire they kind of lucked into getting. Obviously, Morey wasn't necessarily supposed to be available, on the market. Kind of the same situation with Doc Rivers. They had conducted a whole search. They were looking at Mike D'Antoni. And then at the 25th hour, Doc Rivers and the Clippers part ways, and he kind of falls into their lap. And it's a similar situation with Morey. They were looking to, bolster the front office around Elton Brand, not necessarily to bring someone in above him. But Morey's a guy that they had interest in dating back to 2018 when they first put Brand in the role of general manager. They reached out to the Rockets to, see if they could potentially interview Morey for the job. So the interest has been there for a while. And the opportunity presented itself, and they reacted quickly in both situations. And now they have, arguably one of the best front office coaching combinations in the entire league.
Yeah. So for the people who are wondering, what's the impact of this? What does he bring? What changes now about this franchise with Darryl Morey as the president of basketball operations?
I think, obviously right away, nothing's going to change. But in Morey, you have a guy that has a proven track record of, not only winning. The Rockets had, the second best winning percentage during his tenure as GM. They had the longest current postseason streak in the NBA with 8. They came one win away from getting to the finals in 2018. And, they've just been in the contention conversation basically every single year. And he's also a guy that's not afraid to make moves. He knows, a lot of people point to the analytics and this and that about him, but Morey's, his main thing, as long as he's been a general manager, is a pretty simple mantra, and that's that stars win in the NBA. His entire approach in Houston was based around bringing stars in there and building around them. And, he obviously landed Harden, and that was his main move. He brought in Dwight Howard. That didn't work, but at the time, Howard was, a highly coveted player, and Morey was able to bring him in free agency, traded for Chris Paul, traded for Russell Westbrook. So he's clearly a guy that's not afraid to shake things up, and I think that's exactly what the Sixers need. And I also think the front office is hoping that he's going to be able to get a little bit creative with, potentially some of the deals they already have on the books in terms of, the Al Horford contract, the Tobias Harris contract. Morey's a guy that, thinks in the long term, the big picture. And I think that they're hoping that he could, maybe wheel and deal a little bit and get them into a little better position roster-wise than, they are after last offseason.
What does this mean for Elton Brand in his role?
That's a great question, Brody. And that's probably the biggest question I have right now, exactly what he's going to do. Earlier this offseason, Elton Brand talked about how he was excited to finally get to put his stamp on the franchise, kind of implied that, some of the moves he made over the past couple of years were heavily influenced by ownership, and that, now he was kind of going out on his own and he was really going to put his stamp on the team. And now, he's not going to put his stamp on anything unless, Morey's stamp is directly on top of it or next to it. So it's going to be really interesting to see kind of how that dynamic works, assuming, Morey has the final say in basketball decisions. It's going to take, kind of a swallowing of pride almost, I think, on Elton's part to form a partnership here. I think the Sixers are hoping that they can, kind of get a collaborative thing going on where maybe Elton is, the former top pick, the well-known, well-liked player that relates to some of the other players, while Morey can be a bit more of a, behind-the-scenes numbers, deal-making type guy. Obviously that's a best-case scenario, I think, for what the Sixers are hoping. But at this point, it seems like Elton kind of is going to have to, get on board with the fact that he now has someone that's going to be, overseeing all of the decisions that he's involved in. And, if he doesn't like it, I think ultimately, that's a conversation he's going to have with ownership.
So does this feel like Colangelo coming in with Hinkie?
To an extent, I do think it does feel like that to an extent. Obviously, the circumstances are different where Hinkie was kind of promised a longer rope than I think he was given by the organization, and he was kind of misled. Where Elton, was kind of thrust into this situation without experience, and he's made some, clearly questionable decisions. And at this point, the Sixers weren't ready to, I think, cut ties with him completely over those decisions. And if Morey hadn't been available, we would likely be having a different conversation where Elton was still the lead decision maker. But when someone that they've wanted for a few years now and that has a reputation of being one of the best executives in the business became available, Elton kind of became a second-tier executive in the franchise. So I think they're hoping that, that they can, coexist, but that didn't work for Hinkie and Colangelo, obviously. So it'll be, really interesting to see how that dynamic shakes out over the next year or so.
Michael Kaskey-Blomain, the real Mike KB on Twitter. Follow him there. And, of course, the big hire, Sixers hire Darryl Morey. They pair him up with Doc Rivers. They've also brought in a lot of high-profile assistant coaches. We'll get into that in just a second. But I guess the next question would be, Morey's in. You mentioned he's not afraid to shake things up. So does he shake up this roster? And I'm talking the top of the roster.
I don't think right away, Mike. I mean, obviously I can't speak, anything could be on the table with Morey coming in. He might, want to do whatever, but everything that I've been told from, the things that the organization has said publicly and privately is that they have, they plan to continue to build around Ben and Joel, and that there's a sense of, excitement within the organization to see what a new head coach, especially a head coach as, accomplished and respected as Doc Rivers, can bring out of that duo, given the fact that, Brett Brown was the only coach that either of them have ever had. I think there's an organizational thought process that they want to at least give it another year or two under a new coach to get, those two. They're both still young, super talented. They want to roll with them, I think, for the time being. And I think that's fair. I don't think it's necessarily something where you assume that Morey's going to bring the small ball style in its entirety to Philly. Obviously, some tweaks are going to be made. But I think, he will try to build around those two and instead obviously try to, at least early on, try to help build the roster around them, whether, that's trading Tobias or Al or both of them or whatever. But, I would be surprised if without, at least letting Doc Rivers get his hands on them to see what he can bring out of them if the Sixers traded either Ben or Joel.
Do you feel that they demoted or moved on from the right guys in the front office, for example, Rucker or Cohen?
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. I think those were guys that needed to be gone. They were holdovers from, a failed Colangelo regime. They were always kind of behind the scenes guys, and they were just, obviously involved in the decision-making process that led to the Sixers having such an, underwhelming season this past season. So, I think getting those guys out, and now that you bring Morey in, hopefully, he'll bring some guys in to, further surround the front office. But I think, the move that they've made in terms of getting rid of those guys and then bringing in, obviously someone as respected as Morey is pretty much, all that you could have asked for really from the ownership heading into this offseason. A lot of people wanted, moves to be made and things in the Sixers ownership. If anything, I think they've showed a commitment to winning with the moves they've made this offseason and showed they're serious and they're not, they weren't just going to stand pat with, what had been the norm for the past couple of years. I think that's the worst thing they could have done. So, they shook things up in a major way, and they're hoping that obviously it pays off for them.
MKB's with us, Sixers with the big hire. They also added Sam Cassell, Dan Burke. They've added a couple of high-profile, Dave Yeager. This is definitely going to be a team that's going to be held accountable, it seems like. How impactful is the staff that they've put together here?
Yeah, that's another thing, Mike. I mean, not to slight the staff that was previously in place, because a lot of those guys are really good at their jobs. But we're talking about now under Doc Rivers' assistants like Jurger, like Sam Cassell, like the Pacers assistants they brought in. His name is off the top of my head right now, I can't remember. But these are guys that have been established, in the league. Cassell, obviously, a former player that a lot of the players look up to and respect. And I think there's just a lot of voices now that the players will listen to and respond to. And I'm not saying that wasn't the case previously, but at this point, if you compare the two coaching staffs, I think it's fair to say, they took a major step forward with these hires, especially some of these guys, Jurger and Cassell were guys that were looked at as potential head coaches elsewhere. And the fact that you're getting, a great head coach in Rivers and then assistants that are, head coach caliber elsewhere in the league, it's, on paper at least, it looks really good.
Well, I will say this. I thought one of the biggest issues with Brett and his staff was that Brett didn't have a lot of experience on his staff. So, it wasn't a lot of we heard that word accountability, but I just felt like Brett sometimes was the only voice in that room that was experienced at times, and he was inexperienced as well, that he didn't really have that guy, his right-hand man with him. It seems like they just kept losing coaches, changing coaches, and had a very young assistant staff.
Yeah, absolutely, Mike, and I agree with that, and that certainly won't be the case this season. Cassell is not going to be afraid to speak up as he did with the Clippers. Jurgens, with the experience that he's had as a head coach in, other places, Memphis, Sacramento, these are guys that are going to contribute to the coaching conversation overall underneath Doc Rivers, and I agree the accountability was something, the Sixers talked about that in depth when the season came to an end, how they, it was something that they needed to address, and in terms of the coaching staff, I think they've done a really good job of addressing it.
All right. I'll ask you, I guess, Darryl Morey's in. So does that elevate the possibility of pulling off something, major, not with Joel and Ben, but Tobias, Al Horford, something else where they can get another player in here that people will be excited about?
You got to think so, Mike, and you have to think that that's at least part of the reason that, the Sixers were so eager to bring him in, with the hopes that he would be able to improve the roster around Ben and Joel, in kind of with his wheeling and dealing ways. And you think, there's going to be a situation where to get rid of those contracts, you're going to have to offer something up to get another team to be interested in taking them, whether it's, draft picks or young players or whatever. But I think that Morey is a guy that, he values picks, he values draft picks, he values assets, and he's always going to maintain a long, kind of a longer view. And that's something that maybe was lacking from the past front office a little bit when some of these deals were getting made. So I think that there's going to be a balance where he's going to look to, obviously improve the roster, but also not set them so they're kind of strapped cash-wise for the, foreseeable future too.
Yep. Should be very interesting. Draft is coming up on the 18th. Free agency should start right after that. And then we'll find out when the start of the season. They're talking about around Christmas, somewhere possibly around Martin Luther King Day, somewhere in that frame. We'll have all the details. He's Michael Kaskey-Blomain, CBS Sports, covers the NBA, covers the 76ers, and he, like all guests, appeared via the Boardwalk Honda hotline. All right, Michael, take care, pal.
Thanks for having me on, fellas. Appreciate it.
He's the man.